Welcome to those of you that have joined us. We have just opened the live link, so we're just going to wait for a few minutes to allow everybody to join before we start. Welcome to those of you that have joined us. We've just opened the live link, so we're just going to wait for a few minutes to allow everybody to join us before we start. Welcome to the Five Stone Buildings webinar program. We have just opened the live link, so we're just waiting for a few minutes to allow everybody to join us before we start. Whilst we are waiting for people to join, I shall just remind you of the house rules. So just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, please put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and our speakers will try to come to them at the end if we have time. If you do not wish to be identified when asking your question, then please tick the anonymous box so that our speakers will not identify you in their response. And I will now hand over to the Five Stone Buildings mediation team.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. We've assembled pretty much all of our Chambers mediators this evening for a session on what we have learnt from mediating generally, but also through the very strange circumstances of lockdown, where we've all had to adapt to a different way of mediating. And there have been some good things that have come out of that and some not good things. And what we're proposing to do is one by one to take you through the good practice in setting up a mediation, in holding the mediation, some tips as to what we think works, some tips as to definitely what doesn't work, and taking you through effectively the whole day until 2 o'clock in the morning, when all that one can see around the room are empty pizza boxes and some very tired looking clients. Do please ask as many questions as you like. We won't deal with them probably until the end, but we're very keen for this to be an interactive session. And I'm going to start off with Michael O'Sullivan, who's going to tell us about how solicitors should prepare for the mediation.
So good evening, everyone. The key thing that needs to happen for a mediation to be effective is you need to have the key information that's relevant to the dispute. So in the sort of disputes we tend to mediate, obvious key information would be estate accounts, which really do need to be as up to date as possible and include figures in relation to the costs of administration, which are reasonably accurate and up to date, and things like what is the position in relation to payment of inheritance tax, etc. Depending on the terms of the will, assuming it is a will dispute, you may need to work through alternative scenarios. For example, if there's a letter of wishes, you may need to work out what would happen and who would get what if the letter of wishes were followed, as against alternatives relating to the issues in dispute. If you have a company involved in the dispute, you need to have the memorandum and articles, any shareholders' agreements, and up-to-date accounts. And if the annual accounts are relatively long in the tooth, you may need management accounts so that people know what the up-to-date exact position in relation to the company is. You obviously need to consider whether you need valuations for assets in the estate. You need to consider what items of outstanding disclosure you need in order for the mediation to be effective. Often parties argue a lot about what needs to be disclosed prior to a mediation. And sometimes it's better to just get on and have the mediation rather than have that long, protracted argument. But you do need to consider what vital bits of information you need, for example, in relation to financial disclosure in a 1975 Act case. And you also need to identify in advance what problem areas might lurk. And a mediator well known to many people, Michael King, will always refer to this as Auntie's blue jug. So if there is something like a chattel that is going to be contentious, it's better to identify that sort of thing in advance rather than at 8 o'clock in the course of the mediation in the evening. I think it's important for solicitors and clients to consider in advance of the mediation what a settlement might look like. In other words, the shape of the settlement. So, for example, if there's going to be a buyout by one party of the other party, do you need to arrange finance? I've had mediations where people have turned up. It was pretty obvious to all the lawyers that a buyout was the only way the case was going to settle. But the parties had not considered finance or where they were going to get the money from to actually buy out the other party. So the sooner you do that, the better. Obviously, for most mediations, there will be a bundle. That needs to be agreed. I would invite most solicitors to try and make that as concise as possible. Consider what you can sensibly admit. So I personally think there is very little point in including all the inter-parties correspondence, but what the mediator does need is any relevant offer letters that have been exchanged. But having reams and reams of correspondence is frankly not very helpful to the mediator, and is probably going to be a waste of time and costs because the parties have seen the letters and they know what's in them. Position statements, the key role of these is to identify the issues in dispute. Again, it's better if people are concise. Sometimes you have open and closed mediation position statements, so you can have statements that just go to the mediator, which are more open and disclose what your true position is. Those are not generally shown to the other side. You would also exchange something that the other side sees, and that would obviously be less open. You need to settle the terms of mediation agreements in advance. Sometimes there is some wrangling over what clauses should be in a mediation agreement. And I'd invite solicitors to try and be early with the bundles and the position statements so that the mediator understands in advance what the case is about. This enables the mediator to actually then hold pre-mediation meetings with solicitors to try and iron things out. And if something is obviously missing for the mediator, to identify what that is. And on that note, I'll hand over to Barbara, who's going to talk about pre-mediation meetings, I think.
Yes, thank you ever so much, Michael. And Barbara, one of the things that this remote world has brought, I think, much more to the fore is the advantage of having that pre-mediation meeting.
Yes, I mean, I was always keen on pre-mediation meetings and always offer them, or when I say meetings, I would habitually offer a pre-mediation phone call with legal representatives for each party and usually have that offer taken up. In lockdown, where I've done numerous mediations by Zoom, that switched to a Zoom call. And of course, it's all optional, like everything is in other than the participatory structure of the mediation agreement. Everything is optional, everything's made up as you go along. But I found it's something that I intend to keep doing, even when I return to face-to-face. Well, I've done one face-to-face mediation in the last 18 months, but when I return to more of them, is to advocate having a Zoom meeting with each party sometime before, partly for the obvious social icebreaker purposes. Nothing is as good as actually seeing people face to face and being able to pose questions, seeing how they interact with each other, because it's never, I've done very few mediations where there has been any party who's consisted of one individual representing him or herself. That's extremely unusual. Less unusual, one individual and their lawyer. More usually, there are several people, and there are always sort of psychodynamics between those people, and it's quite useful to have your antennae out for them. I think in terms of timing, typically it's the day before. Michael's laid the ground for the things that I have to say very helpfully, because I'm very conscious that time at mediation, time on the day of a mediation, is terribly, terribly expensive when you consider the attendance costs of all the lawyers. And I certainly do a lot of mediations that are not just two parties, but I think I've had up to 6 or 7 parties. So once you start to multiply, even 3, not only is it significantly more expensive because of the participation costs, but also the individual mediator cannot be in more than one place at once. So time management is absolutely critical. And I think the pre-mediation meeting serves a function not only as a personal introduction, social icebreaker, is very important for that point, but really to try and cover as much ground when you've only got one set of lawyers in attendance, as it were, as you can, to get a feel for, is there missing information? Are there disclosure questions which you as mediator can perhaps neutrally progress in the time before the mediation starts? Can you get them to start thinking about, Michael gave the excellent example of a prospective resolution that looks like a buyout. Do you need to make inquiries about finance? I would not be able to count the number of mediations I've been at where one party or another has had to make calls, typically to a funder for some sort of property buyout, or to other stakeholders in the outcome. We're all very au fait with who is attending, what's their role, who's authorized to attend. But the truth is, often there are other stakeholders in these cases, other shareholders agreements obviously introduce people, directors of companies. And so to try and tease all of that out, and also it's something that's very difficult to put into very precise words. But I personally think the anti-split jug thing is quite reductive, and it's quite sexist as well. So I'm not going to adopt that phrase. But people do, every non-lawyer party to litigation has something that preoccupies them, something that is on their mind, and it might not be the way that their lawyer would structure the importance of their arguments. And I do think the pre-mediation meeting it's a job for the mediator to try and, without being intrusive, without annoying these people by launching into your best cross-examination immediately after some pleasantries about the weather, is to try and pick up a sense of what is the thing that is taking up space in the mind of the participants, and to start thinking about the conversations you might have once the mediation gets underway. So I think that's really what I have to say about those meetings. I do think they're important. You can't compel people to have them, but I want to advocate for their desirability and for making them useful.
Barbara, thank you. And I agree with all of that. I think it's incredibly useful. You can find out more sometimes at those pre-mediation sessions than you ever do on the day. But Ruth, we're now actually at the mediation. But Michael and Barbara have talked us through how we get there. You're there. What about opening sessions? They used to be de rigueur. They seem to have become really quite controversial. What are your views?
So I am going to talk about that, and they were very much in vogue. Obviously, in a Zoom world, those opening sessions, plenary sessions, have become something that is very rarely done for pretty well obvious reasons, because it's very difficult to control the clients in an opening meeting when you're on Zoom. But we might be coming back to a post-pandemic in real life world, and my argument in this part of the session will be that we don't necessarily need to go back to a world with plenary sessions. So I think that they don't necessarily need to have. Now, like many mediators, I do see the potential benefit of an opening session, don't get me wrong. I do think that it can be helpful for clients to see each other if they can manage to do that. Of course, if they can't, then they might find a court hearing very difficult, squashed into, I don't know, a corridor of the Sir Thomas More building, although the Rolls building does provide somewhat superior accommodation. I think that actually for a mediation advocate, the opening session is actually a prisoner's dilemma. So this is a idea in game theory, and I'm afraid you're being subjected to it. I did an exciting module of my undergraduate degree. And a prisoner's dilemma is essentially this. I've found out what Wikipedia had to say about it. It's a standard example of game theory analysed so to show how two completely rational individuals might not cooperate, even though it's in their best interest to do so. So in the standard example, two members of a criminal organisation are arrested and imprisoned. Each is in solitary confinement and can't communicate with the other. The prosecutors don't have enough evidence to convict the pair on the principal charge, but they do have enough evidence to convict them on a lesser charge. Simultaneously, the prosecutors offer each prisoner a bargain, and each is given the opportunity either to betray the other by testifying that the other committed the crime, or to cooperate with the other by remaining silent. And basically speaking, the rational outcome for each is to grass on the other, but each would be better off if they didn't say anything at all. So each act rationally, they grass on the other, and they end up with the worst possible situation for both of them. And I think that this is really an analogy for an opening session. I'm not trying to get you to think about what it would be like if you changed career and decided to become a criminal solicitor. It's not what I'm encouraging you to do at all. But my experience of the mediation process is that your submission as a mediation advocate can go along more than one line. So one kind of a very helpful opening submission can be just along the lines of, we're here to settle and we hope that you are too, and we're glad that you've come to mediation, and that can take you forward in the mediation process. You can have someone who has been negligent admit an admitted liability, apologise, so that can be very powerful. Or you might have, for example, a mediation advocate saying to the defendants in a proprietary estoppel claim that she recognises that they're not at fault and the dispute has arisen. It's nothing really that they've done to cause it. And those all are things that might take the mediation forward. But you can also have things that go very badly wrong. And one thing that in general, in my experiences, takes the mediation backwards, not forwards, is a general opening where you stand up and you have a court opening, you say, we're going to win for the following 15 reasons. So that's bad, and it's bad if both parties do that. But there is one even worse outcome, at least for my party, if there's a mismatch between the two. So imagine I go into a mediation plenary session and I say, well, we're here to settle and we're glad you're here too. And my opponent, he says, well, that's very interesting, but you're going to lose for the following 15 reasons. And that's a really huge problem in my experience for the mediation process and for my team, because my client and my solicitor think I look weak. And they think that we have lost ground in the mediation process. And the other side also may think that we are weak because we haven't done a grandstanding opening performance, a tour de force of advocacy. But we have suggested, I don't know, some form of compromise where there might be mutual benefits. And that's actually what happened to me in a mediation which was about a proprietary estoppel farming case. And it was a difficult case because there was a corporate structure that had been imposed over the farm. So it wasn't easy to deal with without, if you broke that, if the court broke it, then that would cause a large form of taxation to happen on the parties. And all the parties lived on the land, they'd all built houses on the land. So there was an inherent benefit to dealing with this on a mutual basis and coming up with a structure that was tax efficient to deal with it. And that's the sort of thing that I proposed. And then the other side said, oh, well, you can't think you've got very much case if you're suggesting that there might be mutual benefits from settling this. And that was the wrong thing for them to take from it. But it was very difficult to then move them from their apparent position of strength. So from this, I really learned that the worst outcome for me would be this, that I appear weak and the client appears weak. And so it would be better for me if I started with a grandstanding opening, because at least we'd avoid that position. So you're locked in that case, that kind of grandstanding opening, and the other side doing the grandstanding opening. And, you know, you probably won't recover from that, so that there'll be an offer before 1 o'clock, and that's really wasted all of the morning. So I would therefore, both as a mediator and as a mediation advocate, not have a plenary opening session unless I can get an agreement from the other parties that they're going to be reasonable and sensible in the opening session. And if that's the case, then I'm happy to have one, and I think that it's a positive thing to do. But in the absence of that, I think that I'd be risk averse about it, and I wouldn't risk the possibility of a mismatch. So for all of those reasons, I'm quite sceptical of the return of the opening session, unless you can get everybody in advance to agree to be relatively sensible and not to grandstand. So that's what I have to say on the opening session. And I think that I'm now handing over to Charlotte, who I'm really glad is back with us in Chambers. And she's going to be talking about parties who are present and parties that are absent.
Yes, and Ruth, can I say that I completely agree with what you've said. I think there are some cases where it can be useful. For example, if you have a charity, it can sometimes be useful on one side. It can be useful for the party on the other side to see who they're facing, to see that there's a human side to that particular charity. But Charlotte, do all the parties have to come to the mediation? Can you do without any?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious answer to the question of do the parties need to be there is yes. You know, anyone who you're going to want to sign up to your settlement agreement needs to be part in some way of this mediation process. One of the things that I just wanted to say about going back to this kind of post-COVID, hopefully, world where we can get back to face-to-face mediations is I have slight fears that we'll end up in a situation where some of the parties want to come in person and some of the parties say, well, can we just come by Zoom? And I think that's going to be really difficult for mediators in particular to make sure that everybody is simultaneously engaged and that everybody goes through the process together, which I think is quite important in mediations. What I would say though, although everybody needs to be there, as a general rule, you know, as Barbara said, mediations are incredibly expensive processes. And so if you can minimize that, I think that's always a good thing. And I think there's sometimes in the sort of work we do some scope for discretion as to who attends. There's a very obvious example in the case of neutral executors. You know, if you have professional executors for a will, who I find in my experience are often very keen to be there. You know, they really feel like it's their duty to come. But actually, I sometimes think rather than having them there taking up a mediation room and eating biscuits, is actually quite helpful to have them back in the office where all their files are, so that they're there to answer questions during the course of the day. So that's one place where I think you can possibly save on attendance. The other example that always springs to mind in our sort of work is where you have a group of parties with a fairly small interest, but perhaps a lot of people. So I always think in will disputes, there's very often, you know, under the second to last will, all of the grandchildren each take £20,000, that kind of thing. And I think if you can think creatively about how to avoid having all of those, you know, 15 grandchildren there, that's really helpful. You know, I've seen that done by appointing a representative for them all. I've also seen it done by just agreeing to ring fence their share of the estate. And that's a solution I particularly like, actually, because I think then you can start the mediation having already agreed something, which is sort of sometimes, I think, psychologically helpful for everybody. The only thing I will say is if you've got parties who aren't there on the day, you do have to really make sure that they are going to be there with you in spirit, just so that they're around to sign the agreement if you need them to. And I think I always find at a mediation, those hours between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. go unbelievably quickly. And you can suddenly look up and realize that actually your poor solicitor, who you told to just wait in the office, has given up on everybody for dead and gone out for dinner. So I think that's one of the things you need to be cautious of with having people not there, is just making sure that they do stay available.
But what about, Charlotte, if you have non-parties? who want to come to the mediation. It's not uncommon, is it, for people to want to bring their spouses, or maybe they're supporting adult children or friends. What do you do about that?
So I think that the attendance of non-parties is something that I find lay clients get terribly upset about. It seems to really distress people when they turn up and there are more people there than they were expecting. Personally, I think it's actually quite a helpful thing to have, within reason, you mentioned spouses, for example, to have spouses or close friends there, partly because mediation is quite tough, partly because I think very few of us make our financial decisions in a vacuum. And I think it's asking a lot of someone to expect them to come to a mediation on their own and then go home to a significant other and say, well, I'm sorry, darling, we have to sell the holiday cottage. I just don't really think that's realistic. So I think if you want people to be in a frame of mind to make proper decisions, you need to have their support network around them. I also think from an advisor's perspective, mediations are notorious for lay clients waking up the next morning with horrendous buyer's remorse. And I think if they've got someone, if they've had a friend or a partner there to help them through the day who they can then discuss that buyer's remorse with, that's probably a lot better than them ringing up their solicitor at 9 o'clock the next morning and saying that was all a horrendous mistake and you've got to get me out of it and I didn't really mean it, which is, I think, really distressing for everybody. I think you do have to deal with it sensitively in terms of the other side so that people don't get upset. I think the best way to deal with that is just to make sure that everybody knows in advance what's going on so that there's equality of arms. And, if she brings her husband, you can bring your boyfriend or whatever. I think that's quite helpful. And I think, you need to be a little bit cautious of the friend who did a law degree in the 90s and, wants to overrule your advice. But, all you can really do there is what you would do if that friend weren't present at the mediation, which is sort of keep as close a line as you can with the person who's actually the party and try not to let them get sidetracked. There was just one more thing I wanted to say on this in terms of attendance by people who aren't parties, which I think just a plea. As someone who has written quite a lot of opinions under Part 21 for the approval of a settlement on the behalf of a minor or a protected party, if you are going to be asking someone to write that opinion, I think it is worth thinking really seriously about inviting them to the mediation, whether it is counsel or whether that's going to be the partner or whoever, because I think otherwise you can open yourself up to this situation where you come to an agreement that everyone thinks is great. And then the worst thing for them to happen is that goes off to council and they say, well, I can't recommend this to the court. And then I think you end up in all sorts of difficulties.
Yes, and funnily enough, you anticipated, Charlotte, the next question I was going to ask you is what do you do about minors and protected parties? And I agree with you. I think it's worth the cost frequently of having somebody there who can actually participate in the mediation. Rather than come at it cold at a later stage. And I'm looking round this, I've asked quite a few people here to come cold to my cases at a later stage to act for a child or a protected party, but there's always an inherent risk.
There's quite a lot of trust in there, aren't you?
Absolutely. We're in the mediation. We've not had an opening session. We've dealt with the sensitivities of people that various of the parties have decided to bring. And now we're getting towards that difficult time of day, which is who is going to blink first. So, Will, how can parties and the mediator best approach the first offer? And what are the pitfalls?
Well, I think it's certainly a critical stage in the mediation, Penny. And in fact, I would go as far to say it's the first offer can make or break the mediation. And I think really the biggest dangers, there is certainly the danger which I think you identified in your question, which is, does anyone want to make an offer? When we are trained as mediators, we are taught various techniques to tease out an offer from one or other of the parties. But for me, I think the most important danger to avoid is that you get a first offer, perhaps plucked rather reluctantly out of a party, which is so far outside the possible settlement zone that it just stalls all further momentum for the rest of the day. And I think the second risk actually is, and you see this sometimes, is that people are perhaps too keen to move to a first offer very early in the day when the other party may want to have further information or disclosure. And so you risk yo-yoing between the offer stage and the negotiations and what I'd call the information exchange stage earlier on in the day. So I think those are the two key traps to avoid.
And what happens when, as a mediator, you get the first offer and it's absolutely not in the ballpark, even remotely?
Well, I think it's a real problem, because what you can foresee going down the line that perhaps the party who's made the offer cannot foresee, because they may think, oh, well, they're rubbing their hands and thinking, well, this is what I'm going to take from this dispute at the end of the day, and it's all going to be accepted. What you can foresee is that you get an offer back from the other side which doesn't move far at all from their own top line, and then you've got the parties very entrenched and at loggerheads, and with no feeling that there is momentum behind the settlement process. And I think there's a number of different ways that this can come about. So it might be that the lay client is very entrenched on one side, or it might be that there's just a genuine disagreement between the lawyers about the merits of the claim. You sometimes get a fear that the other side will have a very aggressive negotiating strategy. And so the party who makes the first offer says, well, I'm going to look very aggressive myself. So I think, in terms of how to avoid this, where you've got a client who's very entrenched in their views, no matter what you've said to them as advisor, I think the mediator is absolutely your best friend in that situation. And what I would say is invite the mediator into the room to help formulate the offer. I think that's something that's been happening rather a bit less in the remote world, in terms of just comparing it with pre-pandemic, that it's a bit easier in a physical mediation for the mediator to turn up at the room and to see how people are going on. You can do that via Zoom, but I think us as mediators, sometimes with the nature of Zoom, we have a worry that we're coming in and we're going to be interrupting conversations, and would it be the right time? But I think invite the mediator in to help formulate the offer, and critically do that before the offer has been formulated, because otherwise you've got a client who is very attached to what they've come up with and what they think they might get out of the dispute. Obviously, where the lawyers on one side have got a very entrenched view about merits, and this is particularly where you may not have specialists in the area who don't know their way around case law so much, undoubtedly a lawyer's meeting can help there. And then when the other scenario I described, where there's just a fear of the other party being extremely aggressive or unreasonable, which we often have in our family disputes, I think, again, that's an area where the mediator is your friend, and the mediator can add value by reassuring the client. They don't have to sign up to anything unless they want to. They can retain other options. But I think one can frame the ability to make the first offer as a positive opportunity, which enables that person to set the terms of the debate, rather than the evil stepbrother, stepsister, whoever it might be.
Yes. And what do you do then? You've got the first offer on the table. You've managed to persuade someone to make it. It's a reasonable opening stance. How do you move the mediation forward?
I think that there's a perception that once the first offer is made, the process is simple and everything just flows from that. But actually it's not. And I think this goes back to what Michael was talking about, where you need to have done your planning and don't think about the first offer in isolation. What you want to do is you want to think several moves ahead. So I think prior to the mediation, you want to discuss settlement parameters with the client as a first stage. And then as a second stage, think about how you're going to get to the sort of settlement that the client can live with. Obviously thinking about taxation aspects in the course of that. But I think what I would say is, as someone who's the recipient of a first offer, definitely avoid protracted responses where the offer that you send back does not concede very much, because there's nothing worse than that for stalling momentum. But what I would give as a tip is to think beforehand about what you're going to give up in the negotiation and when. So there may be something which your client is willing to give up, which is very important to the other side, but is not that important to your client. So I had a probate claim recently where, between two siblings, where one party had as one of their objectives, it became clear, the right to administer the estate alone without an independent administrator being involved. And on our side, we were actually willing to concede this, but with the objective of negotiating a fixed cash sums come out of the estate, and in fairly short order in terms of time. And so I think in that sort of scenario where you've got something that you can give up that the other side want, I would say consider not conceding that right at the beginning, but say do it at the time of the second offer. So you might concede a little bit on the money first time round, but second time concede on the structure. And that may help you to give up less on the money or on the other aspects that you're dealing with.
Yes, well, that I think is a very, very good tactic. And Will, you identified some of the drawbacks of doing remote mediations, and that perhaps the mediator isn't quite so involved in formulating offers. Jordan, from your perspective, what have been the drawbacks of having an online mediation?
Well, I think there's a couple of them have already been discussed by the other mediators, but I think the one that I've noticed the most, and I think the mediator and the parties, the legal advisors rather, have to be really conscious of, is that there can be a real lack of pressure or urgency from the lay client's point of view in circumstances where they're at home, they're in a comfortable environment. It can be quite difficult, I think, for both the legal advisors and the mediator to get parties to focus in the same way that perhaps you could when you have that sense of occasion, that sense of urgency where, you know, everybody's in the room and you get the kind of sense that this is a really good opportunity to move things forward. Now that of course can be managed, but I think I have noticed in my experience that it is something that can become a problem in online mediations. And you know, as Will was saying, the mediator's ability to engage properly with the parties in online mediation it's much more difficult. You know, not just in terms of offer formation, but in terms of testing the merits of the case, in terms of, you know, speaking as a team almost can be quite difficult when you're using Zoom or Teams or whatever. And I also think the exchange of information and the analysis of information can be harder in an online mediation. So, for example, it's very frequently the case that, you know, in mediations where the value of the estate is in dispute or something like that, or there's been a lack of clarity, that kind of stage one is really a discussion either between usually between the legal advisors on the basis of documents which one party may have and they may not have previously given, etc. And that's harder. I mean, it's obviously not insurmountable, but I think, you know, preparation is key. And I think that really underscores what Barbara says, that it is important if you're doing an online mediation to make sure you have that opening session and you know, you've got a kind of list of the information that you think that you're going to be able to need to settle. And
Jordan, what are the upsides?
Well, I guess the upsides are the converse of the drawbacks in lots of ways. So, you know, that lack of pressure in some ways can be a very good thing, because some clients, parties to mediation, you know, they find mediation process, in-person mediation process, quite stressful. You know, there can be a burnout. They tend not to take breaks even when you ask them to. They can get quite upset, and those clients, you know, they're much more comfortable and able to focus, or potentially able to focus when they're in a, in a less pressurized environment. It can feel a lot less hostile, like a much less hostile process, I think. And I think, particularly beneficial, as Charlotte was talking about, it's likely that you're going to end up with a situation where some parties are going to want to attend in person now, and some parties are going to want to attend remotely. And I think that can be a difficult thing to manage. But I think one benefit now we're all set up for remote mediations or partly remote mediations is for elderly and disabled clients and clients abroad. It can make things a lot easier, particularly for clients abroad, because previously when everybody thought we all had to be in the same room, that could really drive the process well into the future. Whereas now, if it's really difficult to get the client from abroad, then that client can attend remotely, even if everyone else is attending in person.
And worst experiences in a remote mediation?
Well, I think one of them was as Ruth is identifying, it's particularly difficult to have a joint session in an online mediation. But I have attended one, I wasn't the mediator, where one of the parties, and I think the mediator as well, insisted that there was a joint session. But the real and it was quite a big mediation, I think there were over 20 people there. And the real problem is that then what happened was exactly what Ruth said shouldn't happen, is that you ended up with a kind of harangue from the side that really wanted to be there. And it's very difficult, much more difficult than it is in person, for the mediator to control that. And so what essentially happened is that we had, what was supposed to be, what was sold as a kind of 5-minute opening session became a kind of hour-long session, which was really difficult. And I don't think that would have happened had it been in person.
No.
And the technology, of course, is obviously a weakness. I did have one where everyone was kind of accidentally admitted to the room at the same time, which was obviously pretty difficult for people, that were quite hostile to see each other.
Yes, there is a danger of that, and also people having power cuts or their internet going can really interrupt things.
Absolutely.
But have you had a good experience that you can tell us about?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. I had one in particular where, which I really just don't think would have settled had it been in person, because for various different reasons, the kind of the childcare for one of the parties was particularly acute, and she was not willing really to leave her children for any stretch of time. And of course, mediations rarely finish at 5 p.m. But it allowed her to. It was a claim that involved her children, and it allowed her really to engage with her children throughout the day, even though they were quite young. I think she felt that was really beneficial, and it proceeded in a much more beneficial way, much more positive way, I think, as a result of that. And I think, in the future, again, serious thought can be given to, rather than just revert, and say it's actually much better to be in person, to whether or not it is in person, it's wholly remote, or it's hybrid.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. And so the day has come to an end with power cuts and internet's going down, and but there's a settlement. Miranda, what are the difficulties for the mediator, that marvelous moment when you go into the parties' rooms and you say you've got a deal? So is that the end of the road, or in your experience, do some of the problems start then? Miranda, you're muted.
In anticipation, I was sitting on my hands in terms of wanting to say, with regard to Jordan, I think the whole concept of being able to help people mediate from abroad, between abroad and domestically, is a revolutionary process that we as lawyers domestic lawyers have been slow coming to. So that's a great advantage arising out of the hideous situation that people are still currently living through. Of course, I have a motto, and I'm going to present a badge to everybody on the basis of being a good girl guide, and that is always to be prepared. And Michael, I think at the beginning, outlined the idea of beginning to think about settlement. So on the basis that we're going to be optimistic about the future, my advice always is to have a clear idea of what type of shape of settlement that you might be able to begin drafting in advance, covering off those matters that might need to be thought about, again, often as it were, even in advance of the hearing, and particularly in the type of world in which we are mediating. One of the important consequences is access to your private client department, because in relation to either a variation of a will, the potential that equally in a probate dispute, you might also be wanting to run alongside the prospect of an Inheritance Act because of the tax advantage that you might be able to obtain if in effect the deceased has died long before the 2 years using your section 144 of the Inheritance Tax Act. So there are real things to be thought about significantly in advance of the day. There is nothing worse than getting to the end of the day and finding that the more sociable hours of the private client department has resulted in that department emptying out, and at 9:30 there being a heffalump trap in relation to tax. The lay clients find it impossible to deal with, and you see all the advances that you have made during the day draining away. So that would be my plea at the outset, to have thought through the potential consequences and have to hand, if not a beautifully prepared settlement agreement, because of course the day will have been full of surprises, just to have thought that through. And equally, if you've got counsel involved, ensure they're doing some drafting during the day in a particular direction.
And Miranda, we've actually got a question that rather touches.
Yes. Yes.
David.
I saw that, and so perhaps if I were to move to this issue of heads of terms on the basis that everybody truly is exhausted. I think it's obviously better to get something in writing rather than have nothing, as it were, in writing, and people go away disappointed in those circumstances. But I think there is a real problem about the fact that part of the magic of the mediation is that all during the day you have the participants, and in particular the lawyers who might otherwise have significant commitments for their time, actually concentrating on the same thing. And the problem with the heads of terms is that there is so many gaps to potentially be filled in at different times, that unless you have got in whatever you have written down a timetable whereby there is going to be a meeting to ensure that the heads of terms are actually fully dealt with, you end up with a desultory email exchange, which costs many thousands of pounds because of the hourly rate, and nobody then concentrating at the same time at the consequences. So I would always, in an ideal world, be moving towards a settlement agreement if that can be dealt with. I think also sometimes there is some confusion between whether your heads of terms, as it were, are binding, or whether actually what it is meant to be is something that is of itself subject to contract and therefore not binding until the final words have actually been committed to paper and then signed in the consequence of the mediation agreement. So I recognise that the reality is that by midnight, and I have found as an experience with Zoom, that actually the drafting, by the time everybody got to the drafting at about 8:30 at night, it was taking a ridiculously much longer time than it would have been if we were all physically present. I think possibly because people are tireder in getting their point across on Zoom than they have been if we're in the same room. And just the email exchanges were taking longer, and disaster about somebody having to be disappearing for important food, not even the pizza box getting in the way. But I do think that, picking up from Jordan, the drafting has taken longer. But once we're back in person, again, I think the settlement agreement is the preferred course. Or if you can't, think about actually timetabling if necessary, with, in fact, the mediator as the default person to oversee and chair that meeting. 2 hours of somebody's time when you're all there together is still going to be much quicker than 60 emails by the time they've gone backwards and forwards to one another.
Yes, and I think Miranda raises a very interesting point. There are very few mediations which are scheduled for more than 1 day. And there is a danger, I think, in 2-day mediations that actually nobody does anything on day 1. So one has to be very careful about them. But I do think that it can be very, very worthwhile, perhaps if parties have pretty much got to a deal but are exhausted, to say, look, why don't we adjourn the mediation and why don't we convene? Of course, there is always the problem, as Charlotte's pointed out, of buyer's regret the next morning. But it seems to me, you know, if a deal has been recorded and can be set down so that everybody knows what has been recorded, either in an exchange of emails or a broad heads of terms, then it can be really beneficial actually to have another session to do the drafting.
Yes, I think probably in relation to that, one might also want to talk about the fact of, if you're not able to bank, as it were, a final settlement agreement on the day, just because everybody is too exhausted, and you might have an 85-year-old who actually I find are remarkably perky, even at 11 o'clock at night, and it's usually the lawyers flagging. But it may be that by then the solicitor is beginning to get quite concerned about whether or not they should be taking instructions at that late hour. And really then it is about making sure that people are not concerned that they haven't wasted the day, and being able to say to everybody, well, look at the progress. On that basis, the person who's made the offer and is waiting for the response, can they be persuaded to leave that open perhaps for 48 hours? And then for it to be potentially accepted. And again, I think there is a greater willingness perhaps to timetable, even if you're not needed. The threat of you being recalled as a mediator just at least means that there is a clear direction of travel that with a timetable for people to think about. Because I think that was one aspect in particular that Charlotte picked up actually in relation to the idea of ensuring that you're going to get your court approval and your writing of the opinion on the basis that perhaps the estate is not so large that they've decided that they're going to allow the attendance, as it were, of the grandchildren, and you haven't got a representative, and perhaps they have been a little bit squeezed in the process of the negotiation. Again, the important thing is that everybody's got to think about is, how are you going to fund within the settlement agreement? How are you going to fund getting that opinion written? Who's going to represent them? And what timetable are you again going to impose? And whilst you can't say when the master is going to approve it, what you can do is to have said, well, the opinion will be written within 3 weeks, and equally an application will be made within a month, so that everybody's got a direction of travel again, not and it doesn't falter on the basis that months go by on that rate with nothing happening.
Thank you. What do other people think about heads of terms? Barbara, what do you think?
It varies from case to case. I've found with drafting, it ought to be better when you're working online, because people have got access to word processing and you don't have that ridiculous rigmarole of somebody who's not in their own office trying to get access to a printer and a photocopier and so on. And what I've found myself doing is, if somebody's taken responsibility for producing a draft, I'll get them to give a time estimate, and they'll tell everybody else that they can go away from the screen. I'll go away from the screen myself. And I adopt an ethical what I regard as an ethical charging policy, is that if there is half an hour plus, I won't charge for time that I don't have to be at the screen, whereas in a face-to-face mediation, I would still be there. So I think potentially drafting can be better done, more efficiently done in an online setting than not, but it doesn't always work out that way. And I think I don't want to be prescriptive about it. There are just some cases where clearly quite careful attention has to be given to drafting, because the giving effect to whatever's been agreed is going to involve property transfers, perhaps in tax warranties, things like that, and better to have that done properly in reasonable working conditions than not properly done. What I think is important is not finishing the day in limbo, so that that either you have what is in substance an agreement, something that is capable of being put into writing as a durable agreement between the parties, or you don't. If you have something that's capable of being put into writing, but for practical reasons it's not possible to reach finality on that, then of course you want the best interim arrangement that you possibly can, one in which there is no possibility of it collapsing because of buyer's regret, because of changing their minds. That's the danger there. The other, where there is not actually a durable agreement, they haven't reached consensus, but they've made an awful lot of progress during the day. I mean, I very much encourage people to at least exchange emails or sign up to something which says that they won't withdraw, that nobody will resile from their current position. Nobody will withdraw any proposal they've made without substituting a more attractive proposal. I mean, there are different ways of wording it, but basically to keep things open so that people can go and reflect on them, or go and talk to partners who are not there, all that kind of thing, and try and keep some forward momentum. And then the final bit of that jigsaw is if you need more mediation time, one of the sort of totally changed dynamics of online mediation is that, subject to people's other diary commitments, it's much cheaper and easier to get people together on screen for another hour or two than it is to reconvene a physical meeting. And I mean, I always offer a reduced rate for continuation anyway, but it's up to the individual fee earners to decide what to do about that. I mean, it's different for a mediator than it is for a fee earner acting for an adversarial party. But I don't want to make people think they can just sit there for hours and then go away without having reached an agreement, and then we can reconvene and have another half an hour of it. You don't want to put that idea in people's heads that they can approach in a kind of lackadaisical way like that. But the reality is, it is easier. You can get things finished.
I think, Penny, too, in the area that we're often working in relation to will validity for execution and probate disputes, it's really quite important that you have thought through, often with the other side, and absolutely with this idea, we've got an agreement, how are we going to express it? So that, for example, the probate registrar doesn't send back what we've sent, so that the last will is still going to be admitted to proof, despite what else we've got in our deed of settlement. Or indeed, if you have got proceedings up and running, how are we going to deal with the master on the basis that we've still got problems from Charlotte's parties? Is there anything we need to do in relation to 19.8? Have we got people appointed to represent people, etc.? I think trying to do that in a void, just because when you've got heads of terms and people are back in their own offices, is actually really very counterproductive and unnecessarily expensive, and risks people getting very set ideas, which might have been much more comprehensively and fluidly and consensually dealt with if those sort of difficulties have been identified, with still having a chairperson, as it were, in the form of the mediator, because the common cause is to get the agreement over the line and the court order.
Well, thank you everybody for the contributions to that, and thank you very much for everyone for joining us. If any questions occur to you, please don't hesitate to get in touch, either with any of us directly or with Jo, and we would be delighted, all of us, I think, to deal with anything that occurs to you that's arisen out of this talk. So thank you very much and have a very good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.